I never thought I'd be the kind of woman to betray my husband. It wasn't in my nature, or so I believed. I was the woman who had it all, at least, that's how it seemed on the surface. A loving husband, a beautiful home, and a career that was finally taking off after years of hard work. But life has a way of throwing curveballs at you when you least expect it. And mine came in the form of a work trip to Chicago. It all started so innocently. My husband, David, had kissed me goodbye at the airport, his familiar scent lingering on my skin long after he walked away. "Call me when you land," he said with that soft smile I fell in love with years ago. I nodded, squeezing his hand one last time before boarding the plane. If I had known what was waiting for me on the other side, I never would have let go. The conference was intense, packed with back-to-back meetings and late-night networking events. And that's where I met him, Ethan. He was charming in a way that felt effortless, the kind of man who could read a room and slip into any conversation like he belonged there. I should have kept my distance, but I didn't. At first, it was harmless. Drinks with colleagues, casual conversations about work. But Ethan had a way of making me feel seen. Understood. And in the haze of hotel bars and late-night walks through the city, I let my guard down. One night, after too many glasses of wine, we ended up in his hotel room. It was quick, impulsive, and filled with regret the moment it was over. I told myself it was a mistake, that I'd bury it deep and never think of it again. But Ethan had other plans. When I returned home, I tried to slip back into my normal life. David greeted me with open arms, and for a moment, I convinced myself I could pretend nothing had happened. But then the texts started. At first, they were subtle. Miss you here, had fun in Chicago, there. I ignored them, deleted them, and blocked his number. But Ethan wasn't the kind of man who took rejection lightly. He found me on social media, created fake accounts, sent emails from burner addresses. He was everywhere. And then one evening, while David and I were having dinner, my phone buzzed. I glanced down, and my heart nearly stopped. Ethan had sent a message with a picture, us, tangled in sheets, blurry but unmistakable. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped the phone. I excused myself to the bathroom, my mind racing. I needed to get ahead of this. But before I could figure out a plan, my phone lit up again. Another message. "Tell him, or I will." I stood there, staring at myself in the mirror. The woman looking back at me was a stranger, guilt-ridden, desperate, and terrified. I had no choice but to come clean. That night, I sat David down and told him everything. The look on his face shattered me. He didn't yell, didn't accuse, just nodded slowly, his eyes filled with a kind of sadness I'd never seen before. He packed a bag and left without a word. But Ethan wasn't satisfied with just ruining my marriage. He wanted more. He started showing up at my office, waiting outside my building. My coworkers began to notice. The whispers followed me everywhere. The rumors spread faster than I could contain them. I went to the police, but they said there wasn't much they could do unless he physically harmed me. "Block him," they said. "Change your routine." As if that could stop him. One night, I came home to find a note slipped under my door. "I don't like being ignored." That was the breaking point. I packed up my things and fled to my sister's house across the state. It wasn't much, but it was a temporary escape. For weeks, I lived in fear, jumping at every shadow, blocking new numbers every day. But Ethan was persistent. He sent messages through mutual friends, manipulated people into thinking we had some grand romance I was ashamed of. He wanted control, and he had it. Eventually, David reached out. He wanted to talk. Sitting across from him in a dimly lit cafe, I realized just how much I had lost. He looked different, hardened, distant. "Why?" he finally asked, his voice quiet. I didn't have an answer that could make sense of my actions. I was lonely, I admitted. I was stupid. He nodded, but there was no forgiveness in his eyes. And maybe I didn't deserve it. Months passed, and I finally went to the police again, armed with evidence, screenshots, messages, recorded voicemails. This time, they took it seriously. Ethan was issued a restraining order, and for the first time in a long time, I could breathe. But the damage was already done. David filed for divorce shortly after. And though I tried to piece my life back together, I couldn't shake the feeling of loss that clung to me. Trust once broken is hard to rebuild. Looking back, I wish I could say I learned my lesson before it was too late. But some mistakes follow you forever. I'm telling my story now because I want others to know, one bad decision can change everything. And sometimes, the guilt is the least of your worries. If you're listening to this, and you're on the verge of making a mistake, think twice. Because once you cross that line, there's no going back. I thought the restraining order would give me closure. I thought I could finally put Ethan behind me and start over. But moving on wasn't as easy as I hoped. The divorce went through without much of a fight. David didn't want anything from me, not the house, not the money, not even our shared memories. He just wanted out. I signed the papers, feeling hollow inside. After the divorce, I moved into a small apartment across town, far from the memories that haunted me. But no matter how far I ran, guilt had a way of following me. It crept into my dreams, played on repeat every time I saw a happy couple walking down the street. I started avoiding people, skipping office events, keeping my head down at work. But even as I tried to move on, Ethan's shadow lingered. The restraining order kept him away physically, but he found other ways to torment me. Anonymous emails flooded my inbox, all too familiar in tone. My social media accounts were hacked, pictures of me and him resurfaced in places I never expected. I started getting strange calls at odd hours, heavy breathing on the other end of the line. The police told me to change my number, which I did, but it didn't stop. One evening, as I was leaving work, I felt it again, that familiar sense of being watched. I glanced over my shoulder, but the bustling streets of New York didn't reveal anything unusual. Just strangers, rushing to get home. I tried to convince myself it was paranoia. But deep down, I knew better. Then came the night that shattered whatever peace I had left. I was coming home late, my footsteps echoing down the empty hallway of my building. As I fumbled with my keys, a voice came from behind me. "Did you think you could just erase me?" I froze, my blood turning to ice. Slowly, I turned, and there he was, Ethan, leaning casually against the wall as if he belonged there. His eyes were dark, and there was a smirk on his lips that made my stomach churn. "You have a restraining order," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. He laughed. "Yeah? And how's that working out for you?" I didn't wait to find out. I shoved my way inside, locking the door behind me. My hands trembled as I dialed 911, but by the time the police arrived, he was gone. That was the breaking point. I packed my bags that night and left the city for good. I quit my job, cut off all contact, and moved to a small town where no one knew my name. For a while, I lived like a ghost, constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at every shadow. Slowly, life started to return to normal, at least on the outside. I found a new job, made a few cautious friendships, and tried to forget the woman I used to be. But inside, I knew I would never really escape what I had done, and who I had let into my life. Months passed without a sign of Ethan, and I started to believe he had finally moved on. Until one day, a letter arrived in my mailbox. No name, no return address. Just 3 words, scrawled in his familiar handwriting. "Found you again." I sat there on the porch, the letter trembling in my hands, tears stinging my eyes. I thought I had escaped him. I thought I had left everything behind. But Ethan wasn't done with me yet. And this time, I wasn't sure I could run anymore. Sometimes, the past doesn't stay in the past. And sometimes, the biggest mistake of your life isn't cheating, it's underestimating the person you did it with. I didn't sleep that night. The letter sat on my kitchen table like a ticking bomb, and I stared at it for hours, replaying every decision that had led me to this moment. How had he found me? I had changed everything, my number, my address, even my habits. I barely posted online anymore, yet somehow, Ethan had managed to crawl back into my life like a relentless disease. The next morning, I called the police. Again. The officer on the other end of the line sounded tired before I even finished explaining. "Ma'am, unless he's made a direct threat, there's not much we can do." I hung up, feeling sick. The system wasn't built to handle men like Ethan, men who knew exactly how far they could push without crossing the line. I needed to do something. I needed help. There was only one person I could think of. David. I hadn't spoken to him in months, and just hearing his voice over the phone sent a wave of guilt crashing over me. "Emily?" His voice was cautious, like he wasn't sure if he should answer at all. "David," I swallowed hard. I need your help." A long silence stretched between us, and for a moment, I thought he'd hang up. But then he sighed. "What's going on?" I told him everything. Ethan's stalking, the letter, the overwhelming fear that I was losing control of my life again. I expected anger, maybe resentment. But when I finished, David's voice was quiet. "I'll come by." That night, he showed up at my apartment, looking older, more distant than I remembered. We sat in my tiny living room, the silence thick between us. "You should have told me sooner," he finally said. I nodded, unable to meet his gaze. "I didn't think it would come to this." David leaned forward, his fingers drumming on his knee. "Have you thought about hiring a private investigator?" The thought hadn't crossed my mind. What good would that do? It's better than waiting around for him to show up again. The idea gnawed at me. A PI meant digging deeper into a situation I wanted to disappear. But it also meant answers, something the police wouldn't give me. "Do you know someone?" I asked. David nodded. "Yeah. I'll make a call." A week later, I met Jack Mercer, a former cop turned private investigator with a gruff voice and the kind of presence that made you feel both safe and uneasy at the same time. He didn't waste time with small talk. "I've looked into your guy," he said, sliding a folder across the table. "And you're not the only woman he's done this to." My stomach dropped. "What?" Jack tapped the folder. "Ethan has a history. 2 restraining orders before yours. Both women moved states. He's been playing this game for a long time." I felt sick. "Why isn't he in jail?" Jack shrugged. "Because guys like him know how to stay just inside the law. But this time, we're going to make sure he doesn't." "What do you mean?" Jack leaned in, his expression serious. "We're going to bait him. Make him slip up. And when he does, we'll make sure it sticks." The plan was risky, but I was desperate. I followed Jack's instructions carefully, posting subtle breadcrumbs online, making myself seem more vulnerable, more available. It didn't take long. Ethan was watching, waiting. One night, my phone buzzed. A new number. "Ethan, I miss you. Let's meet." I felt a cold chill run down my spine. I took a deep breath and replied. "Me, where?" Jack had me wired up and watching from a distance. I sat in the corner of a dimly lit coffee shop, my hands trembling around my cup. Then, Ethan walked in. He was just as I remembered, confident, cocky, with that same dangerous glint in his eye. He slid into the seat across from me, leaning in too close. "You can't ignore me forever, Em." I forced a smile. "I'm not trying to." For what felt like an eternity, I played along, laughing at his jokes, pretending I wasn't terrified. And then, just as planned, I mentioned something only he could have known, something about my old apartment, which he wasn't legally supposed to have been near. Jack walked in moments later with two uniformed officers, and before Ethan could react, he was in handcuffs. The relief was short-lived. A few days later, I got a call from Jack. "You're not gonna like this," he said. "Ethan's out on bail." My hands clenched into fists. "What?" Jack sighed. "His lawyer's good. But don't worry, we're not done with him yet." I wasn't sure how much longer I could take it. But something inside me had shifted. I was done running. Then, one evening, as I was locking up my apartment, I heard it. A voice. Right outside my door. "You think you're safe?" My blood ran cold. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept by the couch and yanked the door open, ready to fight. But the hallway was empty. Only one thing remained, a single Polaroid taped to my door. It was a picture of me, sleeping. I called David, my voice shaking. "I need to get out of here." He didn't hesitate. "Come stay with me." And so I did. I packed my bags and left that night, stepping into the house I once called home. It felt strange, but safe. David stayed in the guest room, and for the first time in months, I slept without waking up in terror. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. And I was right. A few weeks later, the final twist came. I was flipping through the local news when a headline caught my eye. "Man found dead in hotel room, suspected suicide." My heart pounded as I clicked the article. The photo confirmed my worst fear. Ethan was dead. I stared at the screen in shock, a mix of relief and confusion washing over me. But just as I started to breathe easier, I scrolled further. There, in the comments section, was a single cryptic message that made my blood freeze. "You're next." Sometimes, the past doesn't just haunt you. Sometimes, it's still out there, watching. I sat frozen in front of the screen, my eyes locked on those two chilling words. "You're next." It didn't make sense. Ethan was dead, gone. But the message was fresh, posted only minutes ago. My hands trembled as I reread it over and over, searching for some rational explanation. Had someone else been watching all along? Was Ethan working with someone? Or, was it just my mind playing tricks on me, unable to let go of the fear that had ruled my life for so long? David found me sitting on the floor, staring blankly at my laptop. "What happened?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. I showed him the screen, and for the first time since all of this started, I saw fear flicker across his face too. "We need to go to the police," he said firmly. But I knew better. The police couldn't stop ghosts. Instead, I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I took a deep breath, closed my laptop, and walked to the front door. For weeks, I had been living in fear, running, hiding, letting Ethan, or whoever was behind this, control my life. Not anymore. I locked the door, turned to David, and said, "Let's take a drive." For the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel like a prisoner in my own life. As we drove down the quiet suburban streets, I realized something. I had spent so much time fearing what could happen that I had forgotten to actually live. Ethan was gone. His grip on me was weakening. But whoever had left that message, they wanted me to be afraid. They wanted me to run again. And I wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. I leaned back in my seat, letting out a shaky breath. Maybe this wasn't the end. Maybe the past would always try to follow me. But I had a choice now, to live in fear or to finally take back control. If you're still listening, I have a question for you. What would you do if your biggest mistake came back to haunt you? Would you run? Fight? Or would you let it consume you? Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories of love, betrayal, and the unexpected twists that life throws our way, make sure to subscribe and leave a review. Thanks for listening. And remember, sometimes the past is closer than you think. Until next time. Subscribe now and leave a comment. Your feedback means everything.